And this is not really something I'm pruning, it is something on my observation that I've seen with regards to trees and palm over 1 year, not only with Hurricane Ian, but also in previous hurricanes. So this is the affirmative action statement that the University of Florida puts out. So we're an equal opportunity employer and educator. And I'm going to cover 6 things today. Well, 6 things. The first is going to be 6 things that can happen to palms and tree in a hurricane. We're going to talk a little bit about post-hurricane insects, then trauma to meristem, particularly of palms, and a little bit about pruning after a hurricane and damage to prune and unpruned cabbage palm during a hurricane, and then surge aftermath, because the effect of surge was certainly different than the effect of the wind. So there are 2 components to the hurricanes: wind damage and surge damage. So the hurricane, the last one that hit was in September last year, 28th. And before that, in our area and throughout South Florida, we had Hurricane Michael in 2018. We had Irma before that, Wilma before that, and a couple more, including Charlie before that. So here's something: tree species age, health, and structure determine the loss or the stability of many trees. And conditions during the hurricane, such as waterfall and precipitation, also determine just how well a tree will stand up. And there are site characteristics such as soil condition, soil depth, moisture, that all has a bearing on how well a tree will withstand a hurricane. And then urban forest conditions, such as the overall tree canopy, does play an important role in hurricane tree loss and hurricane. So I'm going to go over leaf loss, broken branches, main stem break, a little bit on leaning of some trees, especially palms, uproots, and finally, no immediate visible effects after the hurricane. So let's deal a little bit with leaf loss. So right after the hurricane, you see most royal palm actually shed leaves. And I think this is a defense mechanism so that the whole thing do not have to come down. So leaves are broken. Typically, this is what royal palms do. And other trees, and broadleaf trees can shed a lot of leaves. You see the gumbo limbo on the left? That is one that basically has no broken branches. The other one to the right, you can see it's got torn up through the hurricane. So here are some royal palms. There are 2 time frames here, September 30th. And if you take a look, this is tree number 1 or palm number 1. And you can see 5 months later, it is on its way to recovery. Same with 2, 3, palm 4, all the way to palm number 8. And my experience tell me that within 5, 6, 7, or 8 months, most royal palm will basically, if the leaves are just stripped, no matter the severity of the stripping of the leaves, within about 6, let's give it 8 months max, they basically almost look like normal. There's nothing you have to do to them. Here's another scene on September 30th, 2 days after the hurricane. And you can see that the royals, several months later, well, a year later, they are completely recovered. And the coconut palms, the coconut palm react to hurricanes not by shedding their leaves, but by having the leaves hanging down on their trunk. That's almost universal. So the recommendation is for coconut, for things like foxtail, palms that don't really shed their leaves during a hurricane, such as the royal, is to really prune away anything that can obstruct new growth and keep those leaves that are still green that can provide photosynthesis. So here is a Royal Poinciana. This is on the 2nd of October, a couple of days after the hurricane. And I want to show you it on the 22nd of May in 2023. Now, if you were to drive by that location that many months apart, you would think that that Royal Poinciana has not begun to recover. But you really also have to know the habits of many trees to make that conclusion, because here is the same tree, 7th of December, that same year that the hurricane struck. And this is not a regression of the tree with regards to losing leaf, but this is the habit of the Royal Poinciana. These are deciduous trees. So the tree, in any case, would probably 90% of the time would have lost leaves in April and May, being a Royal Poinciana. But you can see what I want you to notice here. If it just loses leaf, what happened with the recovery is that it basically holds the same canopy. And the form itself doesn't really change if it just loses leaves. If it loses branches, that's a different story. So let's take a quick look here at another Royal Poinciana. Picture was taken in April, and by October of this year, you can see what I actually thought were a couple of dead royal palms, but they were not dead, came back later, and you can see that the new growths coming through. So essentially what happened is in April, like all Royal Poinciana, they tend to go deciduous during April and May. This is Gumbo Limbo. Gumbo Limbo held up not very well. Most of them lost their branches, but I just want to show you this, how a Gumbo Limbo react to losing branches, as we're going to go through in the second of 6 possibilities. But you can see that leaves come up really quick. This is a alley of live oaks. These live oaks were planted in 2007. By 2021, the live oaks appeared as they are there, and they look pretty good. All the leaves are good. This is in the city of Fort Myers. The city takes good care of these trees. They prune them. They prune them often enough to keep the structure. This is what the hurricane did to the tree. This is 4th of October, 2022. And with regards to live oak, this is what it looked like earlier this month. And the leaves themselves, or the canopy, have not really recovered. I did notice that the city pruned the trees right after the hurricane, but nevertheless, the trees have not completely recovered to the form that they were, or the amount of foliage that they were in 2021. So more or less the conclusion is that there are some trees that are quickly recover and other trees that take their time to recover. This is all species dependent. Live oak tend to be slower at recovery than many of the flowering trees. So for broadleaf trees, quick sprouting trees, I have 2 categories, natives and non-natives. The natives include Gumbo Limbo, mahogany, strangler fig, buttonwood, sea grape, and wild tamarinds. And the non-natives, royal palm come back quick, black olive, so does jacaranda, and the other 3 that I have listed down there. And the thing is that we need to allow time for sprouting so that trees can regenerate their energy. The trees are going to want to resprout. They're going to put out a lot of sprout. They're going to put out a lot of leaves, just depending on the damage. And our job is to take care, look at them, and see how they react. That first paragraph, first sentence up there states that many trees will begin to resprout within 3 to 4 weeks after a hurricane, and that's absolutely true. Let's go on to number 2 with broken branches. When a hurricane hit, the force of wind has a path to go. It will there is something called the stress pathway, and the wind follows that pathway and there's stress points in the tree. Those stress points could be because of natural weakness or a disease, or the branches are not connected well with the trunks or with other limbs. So there is that stress pathway. Eventually, that stress pathway can do a lot of breaking of branches. So let's look at this mahogany tree right here. You can see 6 days after the hurricane, a lot of branches are broken. 16 days after, you can see that leaves are coming out. And then by May, it essentially has a full canopy of leaves. On 14th of October, if we take a closer look at these leaves of the mahogany, you can see that the leaves themselves are actually fully formed. They're not green right now because they're newly emerging leaves. They emerge all at once, and now they got to get some photosynthesis. And within really a month or two, this tree almost looked as if there was no hurricane, except since there were so many broken branches, you have totally lost the form and structure of that tree. So this tree on the 22nd of May did not look like it did on the 27th of September, a day before the storm. Let's look at a flowering tree. This is the trumpet tree. And if you look at this tree right here, this is the year before the hurricane. And that's the original shape. This is the day after the hurricane. And this is not too long ago, about several days ago. And if you look here, I want you to see how this tree has regenerated itself. Anywhere there was living bark that was below the damaged area, all along the limbs, but not on the trunk, this tree regenerated. If you look on the tree to the left and the one to the right, you can see that the forms of the tree has really completely changed. So this is a consequence of broken branches. You get a new tree. And here is another Royal Poinciana. You can see in this case, it got really broken up. And about a year later, 13 months later, you can see just how much foliage it has. So it's essentially has recovered. And I guess, is that recovery safe enough, adequate enough to keep the tree in place? And here is a strangler fig. You can see that in the 17th of April, and this is the typical broken branch scenario, a lot of new growth, a lot of sprout afterwards. And this is it essentially today. It's I pass by this tree every day to and from work, and it's essentially totally different than it was before and after. And if you look at all those new growth, that's going to be a hell of a job to get it back into the characteristic form. This is a totally different tree in form. It's not your typical strangler fig, but you know, it has so many leaves that, as I said, it's a completely different tree. Another type of tree that I wanted to show you is this monocot. And after the hurricane, there were 3 calls that I got from customers dealing with their screw pines. If you look at this screw pine right here, and this is, I think, at least a couple of screw pine that you can see, but they're broken branches. But in all cases with these 3 locations, the screw pine branches did not detach from the tree. And when you looked at it, you can see these broken branches that are hanging down that never detach in separate, distinct location with the screw pine. So the branches did not fall away. I just want to give you a quick history. Hurricane Charlie here This is on Sanibel in 2004. And if we follow this through, I know this is not a tree that we really necessarily want in the landscape because it can easily lean, fall, or attract lightning. But in any case, if we look at this tree and we follow it over time, we see that by November 2007, the tree has pretty much recovered. The old branches, if you take a look, have all fallen off, and it has regained new branches that never became in length as long as the old branches were before Hurricane Charlie. And that's the picture in December 2014. If we take a look here, you can't really see it, but I'll show you in the next slide. You can see that there is a sprout from the trunk that produced that. And in June 2023, that tree, same tree, has not begun to recover. Neither did it in October 2023. So my guess is after 2 hits, this is what happened to these trees. And perhaps they can't tolerate that many. So there are actually 2 trees in this picture, and they both recovered from Charlie, but may not recover from Ian. And the third thing we're going to look at is main stems that are broken. And I actually see this occur a lot in royal palms, royal poinciana, live oak, and laurel oak. They tend to break away at where there is a large codominant leader that fails. And you can see quite clearly, these are old trees, by the way. And this is pretty common in hurricanes where older trees, generally because of internal, sometimes unseen rot, generally tend to break away. And here are a couple more examples, one being the laurel oak and the other being the royal poinciana. And the royal poinciana, by the way, it can get really severely damaged and it can still come back. And here's a live oak, same situation. And the next topic here, the next section is the main, well, we're still on the main stem break. This is a yellow trumpet tree, and this is what it looks like today. The form is completely different, and this is where the main stem break took place, and you can see from the bark that is still alive, this is where it puts out new growth. Nothing on the trunk, the lower trunk, but you can see where the new growth occurs, and it occurs all over the branches and all over where the wood is old enough. And more main stem break. There are 2 cabbage palms on the left and a royal on the right. The cabbage palm, if you take a look, they were already rotted out. So my guess is that the primary reason that contributed to their break was essentially maybe disease such as Phthaliopsis. That could have contributed to that. So this is in the same community for those cabbage palms, and they were old cabbage palms. The royal on the right, I think, is a clean break as far as the trunk is concerned. And actually in previous storms, at least in Charlie, I saw a lot more Washingtonians that had broken from the trunk, and they appear to be clean breaks, nothing connected with rots. And Washingtonians and queen palm. So large leaning trees or palm may be a hazard, endangers lives or property. So they could still fall on any day, even on a still day, and they should be removed or evaluated by a certified arborist. And notoriously, queen palms do this all the time. And here are some more leans. These are royal palms. This is in a nursery, and you can see how many, I don't know, maybe 20, 30% are leaning. So palms mostly affected with leaning during a hurricane are really Washington's, Royals, Queen, Bismarck. And trees mostly affected are Norfolk Island, live oaks, and newly planted trees. These are young trees that tend to be pushed over, sometimes even if they're staked. But the key is to make sure they're staked. Then there are uproots. When the top portion of a tree remains strong, the stress pathway makes it to the roots. So in that case, that pathway can find defect in the roots, or the soil defects may be defected, such as saturation of the soil, or you may have compacted soil where the roots are not stabilized in the soil. So these are uproots. And two main reasons for the uproots, at least in many cases, you can see here insufficient growing space. So this is a busy highway where there is not much growing space, and these are old palms, and you can see all that collapsed basically all at the same time. And on the right, you can see one of the palm that fell. And here's another case. This is another large palm. And not only is uprooting responsible for downing palms, but in many cases, especially in palms, and in particularly in royal palms, the royal tend to snap at the base. So snapping at the base was pretty common for old royal palms. So there might be insufficient root to anchor the trunk adequately, and the palm topple over in high wind. And another cause where that may be an explanation is that these palms were already infected with a disease, particularly Ganoderma, that may have caused the palm to fall. And I'm saying Ganoderma because in many royal palms, the conchs often do not appear at the bottom or the base of the palm, even though the palm may be infected with Ganoderma. However, in this particular case, just looking at the base of the royal, this is not Ganoderma. It just looks different. Typically, Ganoderma does not have that type of rot at the bottom. And you can see that, and with these palms, the top look perfectly okay, but it is the bottom that looks suspect. So the canopy is almost kind of normal, and this is what happened. So for trees, and especially for palms, they may be, if they do go down, they're uprooted or they're snapped at the very bottom, at the very base. And this snapping too, by the way, happens even if there is no hurricane. If there is sufficiently strong winds, you will see royals in some cases snapping at the base. So care should be taken with regards to royals. And here are some more uproots, which typically for many live oaks, you often see live oaks fall when they're close to a water source, or when they're close to a roadway, or particularly if the growing space is surrounded by concrete or other implements that might obstruct root growth and proliferation. And although these small cassias or sennas were not uprooted, but you can see that they're fallen over, this is particularly common with small trees that are newly planted. So in this case, if these trees were staked, they would probably not have fell. So that's a row of trees that have gone down and probably could have been avoided if properly staked. And you see in this case, they practically lost no leaves. And more uproots, Australian pine, typically so. And these Australian pine, there were about 5 or 6 of them on Sanibel, and they all fell. On Fort Myers Beach, you can see the Cuban laurel that fell. And that was, you don't even have to have, in some cases, hurricane force wind for some of these trees to fall. Okay, what to do with these trees? Trees to retain, if they're defoliated, no problem. They should be retained. At least check them out, see what happens. Trees with missing or dead twigs or small branches less than 4 inches should be retained. Young trees, retain them, stake them back up, and make sure they're properly rooted. Decay-resistant trees, even with some major branch breakage, can be kept there. Small leaning trees, you can just set them back up. And trees that should be removed, lower main trunk is cracked or broken, and you saw that in the laurel oaks, and you saw that in the live oak. A large stem has split from the tree. Now, we can say that should be removed, but I guess it's sometimes up to, I mean, that would be the recommendation, but some of these trees, especially some of these flowering trees, are in a particular spot that they have been their specimen for many years, and they can still survive even with major breakage and still flower. So that's something to consider. By the way, speaking of flowering, when you saw those Royal Poinciana that were dormant, when they re-leaf, that's typically the time in June that they would flower. So they go deciduous in April, May, re-leaf in June with leaves, and then a big set of bloom. This year, though, that did not happen. There was not much flowering off these trees this year. The same with the yellow tababua that you saw. So the leaves have recovered, but the bloom or the flowering is going to be probably delayed until next year. Okay, so what are the trees to remove? Trees that are likely to fail again, and trees with major severed or broken roots, and trees with many large missing limbs that might be over 8 inches. And the last thing to look at are trees with no immediate effect, particularly true of pines. So they may show no immediate visible effect after a high wind, but they may die sometime later. That's kind of common with slash pine. So they can die over a period of 6 months to a couple of years, generally after a windstorm. And some of these trees will still have their leaves up until the time that they're dead. The needles would turn brown in a short amount of time, and the tree will die. And the cause of this is likely to be hidden damage produced by twisting and bending of the tree itself. And over time, the tree could not survive that over time. And why? If you look at a palm, if you cut a palm down, that palm is not going to sprout again. If you cut down also a pine tree down to the close to the ground or any portion thereof, you will see that it will not sprout. That's unlike the dicots, such as the Royal Poinciana, the West Indian mahogany, the wild tambourine. Those trees, even if you cut them down, they resprout. They try to resprout. So whenever these pines or palms are damaged, in many cases, you will not see the death of those palms or trees until several years or a couple of months or a couple of years later, as they try to push out new growth and are unable to do it because they don't have that mechanism as the dicots do. So here's a quick look at a pink tababua right after the hurricane. This is what it looks like today. And if you look at a slash pine that was damaged where the bark was also peeled or shed, you see there is no rejuvenation. There is no ability, as you can see with the pink tab, to produce new sprout, new growth from the surviving bark. With the slash pine, It doesn't have that capability. And so the tree will generally tend to begin to die over time. So here's a tree. So wait and see after the storm what happens. And this is after Hurricane Irma, several months later. And you can see how these trees are beginning to die in groups. And we always tell people to remove these trees once they start to happen. And if they can put in a systemic insecticide to control the insects that will invariably land on these trees. So here in this year, here's another case where this tree is oozing sap, and the sap is thought to be a defense mechanism, the resins, in attempt to keep out the beetles that are going to really tear up this tree. So you can see the browning of the leaves, and on the very ground, you will see lots of brass, sawdust-looking material, indicating that the beetles have already left the tree. So the pine tree is, I guess, the number one example of a tree not showing any visible effect until months later or even a couple of years later. And this is on Pine Island. And you can see by May, probably hundreds of trees have died on Pine Island because of the hurricane. So here's a survey that was conducted a while ago. And if you take a look at what you see that according to this survey, 56% of royals had high wind resistant, 29% medium, and 15% low. And you can see, if you look at the live oak, 89% have high resistance to hurricane. You know what? This is probably a good survey, but when it comes to reality, you can sometimes throw this survey out because location is so important, and the way the wind came in, the speed of the wind, the duration of the storm is important too. In Hurricane Ian, if you were here for that storm, you wondered when it was going to be over. This was a storm of intense wind and intense duration. And this is my list of wind resistance of native palms. I have 3 in the highest wind resistant category, and I have others in medium to high resistant. Most royals are going to survive, but they don't resist the wind well, as I'm going to show you in another cases. You see Buccaneer, you see Florida Thatch that did pretty well. A lot of them got leaned. You see Key Thatch, quite a few of them leaned over, and even the silver palm. The Parotis tend to kind of die in some places. So to select wind resistant species, plant species that are more wind resistant, a diversity of species, high quality trees with good structure, and match selected trees to site condition. So we want good soil depth and no soil compaction. We want to make sure we have a water table that goes down, not up, not a water table close to the surface. And the tree must have adequate rooting space and develop good cultural pruning practices. And know the lifespan of different trees as well, so in selecting trees. Okay, now topic number 2 was an insect that we saw, actually, particularly on the island of Sanibel in large amount after the hurricane. If you look at the tree on the right, by about March or on the left, by about March or April, we began to get a good amount of report of trees that were denuded, and it was easy to see the cause because there were hundreds, if not thousands, of caterpillars on individual tree. So I went back out there in early October, took some pictures of trees that I knew that were defoliated during April, and this almost happened to the entire islands of Ficus aurea, which is our native strangler figs. And you can see the trees have recovered, and they essentially recovered without any pesticide being applied. They recovered naturally after that. So this is essentially what they looked during the period in which they were defoliated. You can see the caterpillars stripped every leaves, and the caterpillars were so greedy that they began to eat the stem of the plants of the strangler fig. So the Edward moth, these are caterpillars. You can control them with BT, but to be frank, when they're out of food, they almost essentially feed on ficus. If they're out of food and all the population have been stripped of leaves and their natural enemies coming in, such as birds and other things, the trees will come back, as we've seen. And here is one right there. As you can see, they're not very big. Another problem that we did see, not to the extent of the caterpillar, but borers in mahoganies. So there were several trees that we saw, and I've only seen borers a couple of other times in my time here, but after the hurricane, in about April, we began to see some West Indian mahogany with borers. So the larva that bores into the shoot produces a tunnel that's several inches, and the hollowed shoot dies and buckle, and this is what you're seeing. On the right, you're looking at the frass that comes from these trees because of the borers in the tree, in the stem. And number 3 topic that I'm going to go over is trauma to the meristem or the buds of palms. So we all recognize that palm stems are characterized by having a single apical meristem or growing point, also referred to as the bud or the heart. And all the new leaves and flowers develop from this apical meristem. And death of the apical meristem in palms result in the death of that stem or trunk. So let's take a closer look by what I'm calling trauma to the meristem. So this is right after the hurricane, and you can clearly see that the crown shaft can be dislodged from the palm. And if sufficiently dislodged, it's going to fall. Also, a couple of days after the hurricane, I noticed one incident of the crown shaft being completely removed by the wind, didn't fall off. It was thrown off and landed on a live oak, the branch of a live oak tree. So we do know that the force of the wind can actually dislodge crown shaft of these, I'm not picking on royals, but we have so many planted that I'm making a point right here, and perhaps it happens to other palms too. But you can see that dislocation of the crown shaft. Now, what happens when the crown shaft is dislocated? Well, here we see right there that in this case, the crown shaft has been dislocated and the palm doesn't grow back. So this palm was already taken out. So the palm does not grow back. And in the picture to the left, you can see that there is inflorescence on the top of the palm, indicating that the crown shaft had left the palm very recently. Here's another example. So you see right there that there appears to be some fruits on that. And by August of the next year, the crown shaft or no new growth has emerged. Let's go a little bit further and let me show you an example. This is from Hurricane Ian. If you can actually, for palms with crown shaft, you can actually cut into the crown shaft and the palm will begin to regrow new leaves, new canopy. So Hurricane Ian happened in August of 2004, and you can see that new growth coming out. By April of 2005, you can see what has happened there. And by August of 2005, you can see that for the most part, give it another 5-6 months, the canopy basically has returned to normal. Even if you sever, and you can sever that crown shaft much closer to the trunk, and this same phenomenon will happen as long as you don't kill the apical meristem, which there is only one in palms, in most palms. So if a portion of the crown shaft remains, a healthy palm will recover, and palms with these crown shafts include foxtail, Eureka, and Christmas. Let me show you something else that's really interesting. I was driving around and I saw this palm, royal palm that was cut down. If you look carefully, you can see that the crown shaft, despite the fact that the tree has been cut, the palm has been cut, dead palm, that the crown shaft, even after even once being placed aside, is still trying to regrow. So that's how strong that palm, if it retains a crown shaft, will want to regrow. And by the way, that's true with cabbage palms. Even though a cabbage palm doesn't have a crown shaft, you can cut into what seemingly is the trunk. And if you haven't cut into the meristem, it will still regrow. Now, here's another case of what I call trauma. This is another site on Sanibel. This is March 2023. The property owner told me that quickly following the storm, the landscapers pruned them and they also fertilized the ground. This group of palm is in kind of a dip. There is it's basically almost like a dip in the ground, probably about 6 inches. So when I saw these, I said, as everyone kept saying, well, salinity has gotten those palms. Salinity is killing the palms, especially if it was in that lower area where water might have accumulated. So if you look at this palm, this and the second picture, about a year after the Hurricane Ian, September 13th, you'll notice that the palms are still continuing to die. Now, I took a lot of soil samples on Sanibel, probably a couple of months after the hurricane, and I will tell you, and I took soil samples from soil and from sedimentary deposit from the surge. And there was really no indication of high salinity in the soil or the surge. But let's follow this right here. Here we see when this happens, they've lost their crown. And if you look at the picture to the right, you can see the trunk have basically sunken in. This is pretty common. Now, in this case, they lost their trunk or the crown because increasingly over time, if you look at the crown shaft became more and more narrow, more smaller. And it is my thought that the smallness or the narrowing of the crown shaft was not able to support the leaves and they fall. But take another look at these leaves. If you look at these royal palm leaves, the leaves don't look like they've been hit by salinity. You see, they're not really burnt out. They don't have that classical symptom of saline leaves. So if you look at this, now as I said, I took soil sample months before this September, but by September 23rd of this year, I said, let me take a closer look of what's in this soil. And there is a whole range of results, but the electrical conductivity, which is a measure of the salinity in the soil solution, was really low. And when I took the soil sample, I was also taking up remnants of the sediment deposit from the surge. And you can see the organic matter there, which is fairly high, somewhat for Florida. So here's an example of a narrowing crown shaft. You can see again that the leaves have really no characteristic a high salinity symptom. And here's another location. In this particular location, these palms were actually in, you can see water. They were in an area that had a little swale to it, and you can see water collected there. And the same sunken in of the trunk in this community. And I'm going to tell you, if you drive around West Gulf Drive on Sanibel Island, which is pretty close to the water, to the Gulf of Mexico, I'm going to estimate that at least at this point, 10% of the royal have this look. They're crownless and the tops are shrunken in as if they're being dehydrated. And in this particular location, the soil pH here was 8.65, which is pretty low, which is pretty high, but not deadly. And the EC is still very acceptable. And this one was on, in this case, this is on an elevated ground on Fort Myers Beach, and you can see the same phenomenon is occurring. You can see the constriction of the crown shaft. And if you take another look, and by the way, if you go all the way to the left, you see some more towards that building to the left, you see some more crownless royal palm. So this whole line basically got wiped out. And this is the EC. Generally, when I took soil sample on Fort Myers Beach in April, this is essentially what we got for the EC, or the soil pH was fairly high in this case. So apical meristem trauma, this is the death of the apical meristem in a palm that results in the death of the stem in clustering species and the death of the entire palm in a single stem species. So what I want to, the takeaway from this is that the wind itself with palms can be traumatic to the meristem. And let me show you some more examples, okay? Not only with royals, but let's look at Bismarck palm. You've all seen this, I'm sure, driving around the area, where the Bismarck, the middle is gone. And the one by the picture in the middle by the Wells Fargo Bank, that was taken out. The palm was taken out. However, the one on the left in Cape Coral, a year later, it still had no middle. But let's see something else here. Let's watch this. Here is another palm I was looking at. This is June 14, 2023. You can see it had no middle. But the leaves are not dried up. If you take a look here, here's new growth coming out of it. And this is the 31st of August. So this was almost a year later, and you saw new growth. And by October, this is what happened. So with Bismarck, the bud can have there can be trauma, and I think it's due to wind, not any salt damage, because this is in Fort Myers where there was no surge, and this is what happened. So they can recover, and you see a couple of examples there. So the recommendation for some of these is to retain broken living leaves, remove the leaves that may prevent new growth from emerging. And this is can be something that we need to recognize, that old leaves that are bent and broken can actually prohibit the regrowth and the good health of the palms if they're not removed, as they lay over and prevent new growth from coming out of the bud. Now, here's another example that I call trauma of the bud. Okay, these are kind of somewhat healthy queen palms for our area, probably healthier than most. And I'm sure many of you have seen this. It almost kind of looked like boron deficiency. But with queen palms, particularly with queen palms, we see this, the crown being displaced and are leaning to one side. And in some cases, they do fall off. And they may actually resprout a new growth after this old one have fallen off. So this is, and you can see with the picture, August 2023, there are two palms right there. And you can see that even in close proximity, not all queen palms would be affected in the same way. But this is really common to queen palms during a hurricane, and much more so than normal. And I saw 2 cases of date palms going through the same thing, where you can see the crown is leaned to one side. And in this particular case, you can see new growth coming out from the bud, and the new growth look like typical, almost boron deficiency. Let me show you another example of another palm to get my point across that there is bud trauma with palms. This is a coconut palm, and I got this email from someone who took this picture from his house, and this palm is on his property. And if you look carefully at coconut palms, the new leaves that are emerging after the storm look singed. They looked, they're not opening up properly. And though that emergence or that damage of the new growth occurred while the palm or the leaves had still not yet emerged. This is an ongoing thing with coconut palms. About most of them are almost recovered from this, but if you see the leaves that emerge immediately after the storm, you'll see this. And there are many cases. Here are 2 more cases that are independent from the customer's case. And you can see, and this has happened in Sanibel, Fort Myers, and all over. So the wind doesn't have to be the greatest of speed. And you can see what is happening. The emergent leaf look as if they are singed, as if they are manganese deficient. And typically what happens to foxtail palm as far as trauma, the leaves just bend and hang down on the trunk. They really don't get blown away. And you can see that right there. In 2004, during Hurricane Charlie, you can see the palm to the right. It had, the middle was gone from that. And by 2007, the palm had recovered. So, and that looks like a bud rot in 2004. But by 2007, the palm recovered. That was 3 years later. So even though you might see, as you saw with the Bismarck, the bud or the center growth may be missing, it doesn't necessarily mean that the palm is dead. So recommendation here is retain the hanging leaves. However, prune away hanging leaves, whether dead or alive, that would obstruct new growth. So wind damaged palms, such as foxtail, often has this phenomenon. So make sure that's gone from the palm. Let's take a quick look at coconut palms. This is at a location going to Sanibel, and this is 27th of October, about a month after the hurricane. You see what they did. They basically prune all the coconut palms here, but by 18th of September this year, they've all come back. And let me show you another example right here. This is from Charlie. These were pruned. You can see all 3 were pruned. And by December 2004, you can see what has happened right there. They're coming back, both the young ones and the taller one. And 3 years later, I think, you can see that the palms have made good recovery. These are coconut palm. So pruning away the leaves, even if they're all green, doesn't seem to affect the recovery of coconut palms and perhaps other palms as well. And just to illustrate it, so pruning after a hurricane, at least for coconut palms, they come back. And let me speak number 5 about damage to prune and unpruned cabbage palm. I want you to take a look at the picture on the left. And in the foreground, you see 2 cabbage palms that were pruned shortly before the hurricane. And if you look at them, they seem rather beaten up. The cabbage in the backgrounds were not pruned, and you can see that they look good, like no hurricane damage. Let's take a look at the picture on the right. In the foreground were 2 unpruned cabbage palms, and in the background, between those visually between those 2 palms, you can see pruned palms, pruned cabbage palms, and the canopy looks really bad. But so I guess the takeaway lesson is don't prune them. Hurricane pruning doesn't work, but the story doesn't end there. Let's take a look at this picture right here. In this picture, you can see that the pruned palms did not look good shortly after the hurricane. And if you follow this, there's a to the left, there is a little road that goes down, and the palms that weren't pruned along that road look like this. So they look pretty good. Now, what happened to those palms that were pruned? How do they look today? So they were pruned, and this is how they look today. So they recovered. These palms, the one October 16th, last year, 2022, I know because I go by and I look, and those leaves that are hanging, they were not pruned off. And what happened is a year later, the canopies of these palms, I mean, they're not as full as the other palm in the background lining that roadway, but they still look pretty decent, even despite the fact that they got beaten around. Here's another example. In this particular example, this is October 16th. You can see pruned and unpruned cabbage palms. And the unpruned look pretty decent, like nothing happened. And the prune looks certainly like something happened. Because remember, when they prune these cabbage palm, they prune them so that the leaves are like standing up in that 10-2 o'clock position, so they're straight up. Now they look all floppy. Let's take a look at how they look not long ago, and they've recovered. See, they don't look too bad. They don't look much different than the palms that were not pruned. Although I do think that the palms that were not pruned, right there, they pruned them after the hurricane a couple of months. So they also, that's why they look as if they don't have that full crown. So they did prune them, but the one that were damaged, they did not re-prune those. And one thing I would want to mention, that this hurricane and previous hurricanes gave me a great opportunity to study damage of palms side by side. You can see the coconut there, the Perotis there, the Royals there, and others. So side by side comparison. The palms that I think surprisingly did the worst during this storm were the Areca palms. And basically, if they look like this, they're basically dead Areca palms. And this is a different site. The picture on the left is palms that have not yet been cut back, and they and on the picture on the right is in the same roadway, but across the street. And this is what happened. So the 13th of June, the palms were still essentially dead, and they cut back the Arecas down to the stumps, and this is how they look. And on the 6th of October, they're not growing back. So when you see Arecas like this, essentially you may want to consider that they're basically dead palm. And you can easily tell because all the stem are all sunken and dried up, and you can just easily remove them. So this is a simultaneous comparison of damaged palms. And you can see the Areca there on 13th of June, excuse me, the cabbage, they're pretty much recovering. The Arecas were not. And perhaps the number one palm that withstood the hurricane was not natives as much as is this particular palm. This is a pygmy date palm. The landscaper told me that she put it in a couple of weeks before the hurricane, and it came through fine. So she must have done some good planting right here. But pygmy date is a really top contender for being a good hurricane-resistant species, even more so than the cabbage palm, the native palm. So storm tolerance of landscape palms, I'm going to say the pygmy, saw palmetto, which is native, that's clustering palm. Christmas is excellent. Cabbages is good, but I think the Christmas is actually better than the cabbage. Bottle, spindle, and Canary Island. The African oil palms were good: Buccaneer, Solitaire, Triangle, Royal, and Coconut. I put the coconut because you can see the new growth look as if they were manganese deficient. And of course, the worst: Bismarck, Eureka, Queen, Foxtail, Washingtonian, Carpinteria, and even Date Palm. Now, your observation could totally be different from mine, and I would really like to hear what you think. Let's do a quick thing of the surge. I'm going to try to wrap this up really quick. This is Fort Myers Beach. This is really the surge. All of that beach area there was planted with sea grapes, sea oats, all of that stuff that is required along such an area on the beach. So this is what I call the scouring of the beach. The surge came in, and what happened? Well, let's look at some of the deposited material. This is Fort Myers Beach. This is a collection of the surge material. So when we say surge, it's not just water. It's mineral matter that is washed to shore along with the force of the water. And here's some more examples. One on Pine Island, one on Sanibel. So all along the roadway, and I mean, why would it accumulate in such a large pile? Because much of the material that they took, they came from the roadways, it came from parking lots, it came from tennis court, which and then they piled them up in these piles, and this is what happened. Now the material themselves, as far as the depth of the deposited material, now the material were kind of sticky and clay, but the layer that was left behind by the surge was usually 1 inch to 2.5 inch, most of them being about 2 inches. So the layer of the surge material was not really thick. Now, with regards to this, we essentially tell people to mix that material in with the soil, because when we did the testing, there wasn't much of a salinity problem, or none at all. And as a matter of fact, that material that was deposited on land actually was rich in some nutrients that much of our soil may lack, such as sulfur and iron. So that surge material was a good source of that. And another thing that we noticed after the surge, if you drove around 2, 3 months, 4 months after the surge, at least from my perspective, I didn't see really any plants that had salinity problem, symptom of burn from salinity, with leaf margin and all that. What you did see when that happened, what you did see was the surge itself, the water, and the surge may have been, in these cases, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 feet deep. And when they pulled back, they actually damaged the foliage of many plants. So that browning and blackening didn't come from salinity. It came from being battered and underwater for, and that surge water didn't last long, 2 or 3 hours, usually at the most, then it was pulled back in. So can you imagine that massive water coming on land and it's gone within 2 or 3 hours? So that is a big engineering task. So what happened? Near the water, what you see near the Gulf of Mexico and in those areas, what you see as the water regressed back into its source, it actually scoured, it actually took soil away from the beach area. So essentially what has happened is, close to the water edge, soil was removed. Inland soil, not in thick layer, as I said, about 2 inches on average, were deposited inland, but closer to the water's edge, to the source of the surge. What happened was, and you can see in these coconut palms, you can see in, I think these are wild tamarind, you can see exposed roots. So let's look at something real quick. I know we got to go, so let's do this really quick. This is the soil solution quality guidelines expressed in parts per million and EC. And essentially what this is saying is that if you have an EC of over 10, you need highly tolerant plants to adapt to that soil condition. Now, let's look at the mangroves, because this is a particular situation. Generally speaking, red mangroves can tolerate very high salinity, 85 to 92 EC right there. And the black and white can even go higher. However, mangroves under this much salinity, the growth are not great, but they survive and they continue to live. So here is this, I think this is in April of this year, and you can see at this particular point that the mangroves have not recovered. And if you look at the EC, this is at the Shell Point location, the EC was 42.7, which technically for red mangroves, they should be able to handle that no problem. So it wasn't salinity that killed these mangroves, and there's a lot of mangroves that are dead in some places. And you can see the EC was reasonable for mangroves, for red mangroves. If you take a look at this particular location, this is April 12, the EC there was 24.7. Manageable, very manageable for mangroves, no matter the species. Probably even manageable, I dare say, for, I don't know, for Brazilian pepper, who knows? But if you take a look here, I think what I want to point out, with all of these dead mangroves, what got flung into those areas were propagules from, for example, Australian pine. Now, the area may not be conducive for Australian pine, but there is the potential of invasive moving into those areas, mangroves areas that has been there for who knows long. So this is the this is perhaps a reason why the mangroves are dying, and it is connected directly to the surge. So mangroves are extremely salt tolerant, so salinity is probably not the issue in this case. Instead, it's what we call insufficient tidal flushing. Water comes in and it can't get back out. Let me show you something right here. In this particular case, the roadway is to the right, and where the mangroves are dead, it goes down about 3 feet. So water rushed in to that area, and they weren't able to be flushed out. They didn't have that draw that you see where the coconut palms and the others were next to the beach, and that removal of the sediment. And essentially that water got trapped. The mangroves can take salinity, but they cannot tolerate high or a prolonged period, months after the storm, where the water sits. So the water was not pulled out. Instead, the water sat there for months, and the trees were not able to recover. So downward or blockage in tidal flow can cause water to not drain, and mangroves don't like standing water, and this is what can happen. Another thing I want to point out with regards to this, and I think I did mention it before, take a look there. You can see what's growing in this area are the ear potatoes. So if the Australian pines or whatever couldn't make it, I think this vine can probably make it along with others. So my concern with regards to the surge is that in some areas it caused massive dieback of mangroves. Now, I'm told that perhaps in 4 or 5 years, the mangrove will begin to recover. That is something that I want to see. But at least right now, it looks pretty bad. And right now, there's the opportunity for other species of plant to move in that can tolerate that condition. And really quick, I'm almost done. Here's another location in Sanibel that I looked at. In this case, the plants that were completely dead were the cocoa plums that were there, and cocoa plums didn't tolerate the storm at all, no matter from wind or from surge. And the ball cypress were basically dead. But look at the soils, EC. This is another depression right there. This is another depression. And as you can see in this depression, the ball cypress, and in this community, there were a lot of ball cypress and they didn't fare well. And again, the EC was pretty high, 34.8, as you can see right there. And these ball cypress were dead. Sap flow from the trunk, you can see it right there. That's an indication. Bark with vertical cracks is another indication that something that is dying. And frost around the tree, indicating that there were insects in the tree itself, and they were exiting, and that's what you get, totally dead tree. And here's another case. Could this be high salinity? And the salinity on this was pretty low, but this tree is a ficus species that was devastated by the Edward wasp moth. And so I'm just pointing these out, that when you go through all of this landscape, there is a lot of different nuances that you have to look at to see what's going on. So symptom of dead tree is vertically cracked bark. If you see heavy shedding of the bark, and foremost, if you see lots of exit holes coming out of this, and I'm not even sure what insects are in these trees, but basically if you see that and frost around the tree is essentially dead. This one here, the last two pictures, is of a ficus strangler-fig. So those are pictures of strangler-fig. So my recommendation is, this is my last slide, is that we need to develop 2 separate hurricane-resistant lists. One for wind tolerance of trees and shrubs, and another for surge tolerance of both wind, of both trees and and surge. Excuse me. One for wind, one for surge tolerances. This is, I think, what we need to get into, because I've never really seen a surge until last year, and I've been in this location for 30 years. And I'm sure it has happened within my 30 years, but I've never seen such devastation. And my recommendation is, let's look at hurricane and give recommendation with regards to wind and surge tolerance. So I do apologize that I was late today, my sincere apology. And if you have any questions, I guess I'm ready for them.
Folks, yeah, if you get any questions, I mean, you can go ahead and put them in the chat, or you can unmute, or put up your video up. Either way. But yeah, got some comments here. Thank you so much. But I guess I've got a question or two. What was probably the most widespread form of damage? You went through a couple of major characteristics: broken main stems, the leans, things that were getting uprooted, and then so I guess maybe you can break this down in a couple different ways, and the mangroves too. Maybe what was the most widespread in terms of area type damage, and then like what was the most common in terms of like a specific species or defect that you saw?
The most common damage in terms of, it depends where you were, but in the hardest hit place, it was definitely broken branches. That was the hardest hit area. However, in less hardest hit area, because they were more urbanized, you saw a lot of leaning going on, including of oaks and others, because they were next to hard surfaces. And and what was the second half of your question?
I guess it was like maybe specific species, and maybe that segues with the question here that somebody asked as well. How did buttonwoods and pigeon plums do?
Okay. Buttonwoods, whether they were silver or green, those are excellent plants for not only wind resistance, but surge resistance. Where others die, they live. And as a matter of fact, the buttonwoods, green or silver, immediately after the storm, I mean, I was there a couple of days after, and they looked like there were no surge. So you had golden creepers, you had coca plum, all these other natives that were dead. And these buttonwoods were in the form of hedges and were in the form of trees. And along with that, sea grape in the form of trees or hedges did remarkably well. And the buttonwoods really didn't need to regrow except for the trees that were broken, limbs were broken, but they did not have any high mortality. So the best species actually, and by the way, another this is not a tree, but junipers that are ground cover, fantastic. The ficus, what is it, Green Island, fantastic. Really took surge well. So there were a lot of species that hanged on really well. They were ground covers in many, or grown as ground covers. But some trees, the black olives, for the most part, did not do well. And what happened to black olives, if there were, not many of them fell, but lots of broken branches, but immediately, like the next week, you see new growth on the trunks themselves, not only in the branches, but all along, up and down the trunks. So that's a mess.
What about for fruit trees? I know some of them are pretty weak compartmentalizers, like mango, but I think that some of them might have pretty good salt tolerance too. Do you notice anything with regards to them?
Yeah, the mangoes broke easily, and they're not very wind tolerant, but and some of them I saw were dead close to the water. They were totally dead. If you have a grove of mangoes and you prune them correctly, and I've seen this from Charlie in particular, they will come back if they're pruned correctly, but they don't tolerate the wind and they get broken up. So you might as well just prune them, get them to the recommended size for fruit trees so you can pick them easier. And that was a good opportunity for some people. Avocados, I see them coming back. And what I'm watching for is maybe a laurel wilt or something, but I haven't seen that. So and I didn't see any lychee or in the area that I was, at least I didn't see any. I'm sure they are, but those are the two fruit trees that I can make comments on.
We got something in the chat. Thank you so much for your curiosity and taking time to take the pictures and explaining the hurricane impacts. And yeah, generally, yeah, you're getting a lot of awesome feedback here. And I don't know if I see any more questions here. But so this may be a good point to, I guess, to end the webinar. But I just wanted to say thank you for being here, being our speaker. And you've been a huge exemplary agent for some of us new agents out there. I mean, we see your work all over this place, and so it was really means a lot having you here as our presenter today. And I mean, really awesome work. Really, what I've noticed that is so great is that, like, you know, you can have a lot out there with science and data, but there's a term out there called ocularly significant. And like, I think a lot of your work, you know, it goes out there and actually shows visibly like what's going on. And that speaks a lot, because there's so many of us that are just so visual in terms of how we learn. And I've always loved like seeing your examples from other PowerPoints. So
Yeah, and I just want to close is that I'm not done looking at these palms or these trees because of the hurricane, the effect. I want to continue looking at the Bismarck to see if there are any weevils that will develop or any other stuff. So this is ongoing for at least another year, because I think the damage, the full story has not yet been told.
well, if you keep track of things, and we'd love to have you back and present more. I mean, and I know that you've got all sorts of series out there too, like on the flowering trees and things like that. But yeah, this is a lot to digest, and I know I'll be going back to look at this PowerPoint or this presentation. And I guess speaking for which, it's all been recorded. Everybody that's attended, I will send you. We were going to try and do a poll, like, but we will send a general survey out with it, and along with the YouTube recording from this as well. So I guess with that, yeah, thank you again, Stephen, and look forward to seeing everybody next month, and for the next edition. So take care, everyone. Have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.